Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that we have started with a new series on important movements in cinema, and so far we have conducted one lecture under this series. Dear friends, taking the series forward, today we would be discussing on early Soviet cinema and introduction. This is an introductory lecture in the first half, and in the second half we would be discussing on the important filmmakers. And for this discussion we have once again within our studios Ms. Namita Paul. Ms. Namita Paul is Assistant Professor in Department of English, Kamla Nehru College, University of Delhi. So dear friends, I would like to welcome our guest Ms. Namita Paul, under whose able guidance we would be discussing on cinema at a large. So without wasting any time, I would like to welcome our guest, Ms. Namita Paul. Ms. Paul, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to look at a very interesting period in cinema, which is early Soviet cinema connected to a particular nation, connected to a particular geographical part of the world. And as we had discussed earlier in the definition of movements in cinema, this is going to be one of the movements which is related to a particular geographical area and also a particular time period. So it's very important for us to begin with learning about the basic history of the Soviet Union, of the USSR, right? So I would first like to talk about the Russian Revolution and how the Russian Revolution changed the nature of films and cinema in the USSR. So the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 was a very important historical event which completely changed the nature of the entire nation, the entire country of USSR, and there were some very important events that happened during this time period. So first, the Tsarist autocracy was eliminated. So USSR no longer had a monarch, right? They no longer had a king. That is what the Tsar means. And the centralized control that the monarchy had was removed during this Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917. It's an important date to remember for not only students of cinema and film, but also for students of history and political science, because there were not only historical changes that were happening or changes in culture, but also changes in very important changes in the politics of that particular country. The second important change which happened was that the Russian Empire collapsed with the abdication of Emperor Nicholas II, and he was replaced by a provisional government during the first revolution of 1917. So this is important. The Russian Empire collapsed completely, right? So the idea of how the nation was constructed changes, not only in terms of the geography of Russia itself, but also in terms of its relationship with its neighbors. The Tsar abdicated his throne, and his rule was replaced by a provisional government which was there for a short period of time, right? And the purpose of the government to ensure that the country did not go into a complete state of chaos. And this was the first revolution of 1917. There were a series of protests, a series of revolutions that happened across Russia. So think in terms of not one major event which changed the face of a nation, but think in terms of a series series of events, a series of revolutions that are happening during this time period, which changed the nature of how the nation was looked at. Then in the second revolution that October, the provisional government was removed and replaced with a Bolshevik government. Now, when I use the term Bolshevik, I am referring to a particular kind of ideology, a particular way of thinking about society, which is communism. So, the Tsar is replaced by the provisional government, and then the provisional government is replaced by the Bolshevik government in the Russian Empire. So, it's a very major change for any country to go through, to have three different forms of government in a very short period of time, in a matter of few months. So imagine how people and intellectuals were thinking, how artists were looking at their world would have changed. A sudden state of crisis which changes things completely in the political world is obviously going to have an effect on art and culture, not just films, but also literature and music and drama and theatre. So think in terms of all of these connections. That is why looking at the historical nature of this event is very important in order to understand Soviet cinema. Right now, the next thing I want to talk about is the Soviet Union. Right, so the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is abbreviated to USSR or shortened to the Soviet Union, was formed when the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government. Now, this is a term that you might have heard about. You must have heard of the USSR, right, as a country. It no longer exists, of course. The USSR collapsed, but once the provisional government was replaced by the Bolsheviks, this led to the formation of the USSR, which then went on to be a very important country in terms of international relationships, in terms of how the world functioned. So it is no longer the Russian Empire. The name itself of the country is changed and it becomes the USSR. Again, look at the name, Soviet Socialist Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So they are telling us what is important for them in terms of terminology. A union, right, of nations that come from different, that are close to each other, but have different languages, but have slightly different cultures. Then it's a Soviet Socialist Republic. Socialism is the political ideology that the USSR believed in. Then it's a Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union is again the shortened form of the USSR that's used very often. The Soviet were workers' councils. That is what Soviet means. So obviously power has shifted towards the working classes, towards the proletariat in the USSR. Then it was a Marxist-Leninist state on the Eurasian continent that existed between 1922 and 1991. So these are the years during which the USSR existed. It was part of the Eurasian continent. And the philosophy and the political ideology was largely Marxist-Leninist. Then the Soviet Union consisted of multiple subnational Soviet republics, and its government and economy were highly centralized. The Soviet Union was a one-party state governed by the Communist Party with Moscow as its capital. Now, this is important that it consisted of many different republics working together. So, think in terms of, again, a variety of ideas coming together to create something new. That is going to be a very important aspect of Soviet cinema, the coming together of forces from slightly different ways of thinking, right, and how it then came together to become what we know as the Soviet Union, right, and cinema from the Soviet Union. The other important aspect is that the government was highly centralized, right. Now, it's going to have an effect on filmmakers and filmmaking as well. Whenever government and power is centralized, on the one hand, it is easy to encourage filmmakers to make particular kinds of films, to work in particular kinds of ways, but at the same time, it also means that censorship grows over a period of time, and filmmakers are expected to make films in a particular way. So that is the history of the formation of the USSR and the Soviet Union, and like I said, the history always has a very important effect on how filmmakers formulate their ideas and the kind of films that they eventually make, and what brings them together to become part of a particular kind of movement. So please keep in mind the history of that particular period. It's extremely important, particularly in the case of Soviet cinema. Now, I want to talk about culture after the revolution. So, we've talked about the changes that have happened geographically and the changes that have happened politically, but what was the culture after the revolution? So, the USSR saw the beginning of a new social order based on the doctrines of socialism and communism that would not only be just and equitable, but also have the desires and aspirations of the people or the proletariat as central to its ethos. So, the focus is not going to be on the Tsar. The focus is not going to be on the monarchy. The focus is going to be on the aspirations, on the future of the working classes, and the who are often called the proletariat in Marxist philosophy. So again, these are important terms to keep in mind: the proletariat, the working classes, Marxism, Marxist philosophy, because this brought about a very important cultural change, right? So filmmakers are going to focus on the needs and the wants and the desires of this very large group of people, the masses, the working classes, the proletariat. Then art, science and industry were to be combined with human labor. Now, this is a very important coming together of ideas which for a very long time in the industrial period were separated from each other. Art especially was seen as something which is separate from industry, which is separate from human labor. Artists were seen as people who live in ivory towers, right, which means that they were not always connected to the people, but once the political and social structure of a country changes, then it is important for manufacturers of culture to also connect with the central idea, with the central ethos. So art, science and industry were connected immediately with human labor, with work that people do using their bodies, using their hands. They were art was not seen as something that is only for the elite. In fact, art became increasingly connected to the working classes and the masses. That was very crucial for filmmakers in the Soviet Union. Then, along with literature, painting and the performing arts like theatre, dance, the art and craft of cinema were also to be used to achieve the goals and visions of the revolution. So, along with filmmaking, literature, painting, music, dance were supposed to work together to promote the ideals of the revolution, right? The idea of equality, for example, or the idea and the importance of work, of physical labor, right? And those of communism and socialism. So and cinema in particular was seen as a very important tool that would work towards promoting particular kinds of ideas. So culture became part of the political agenda of the government and that of the people. So art was no longer going to exist in isolation. Art was going to be deeply connected to political ideas, historical ideas, and philosophical ideas. So that's a major change that's happening in terms of how culture is functioning in the USSR. Now that we have talked about culture in general, I want to talk about cinema before the revolution. So, in order to understand how things changed after the revolution, you must know about how things were just before the revolution, what kind of films were popular, what kind of films were being made before the revolution, because the technology of filmmaking was already available in the European world before the Russian Revolution. So, we need to look at cinema before the revolution. So, prior to the revolution, the film industry in Russia was mainly European, and 90% of all films screened in Russia were imported and were mainly from America, France and Germany. So, Russia did not really make too many films of its own. What it was doing was importing cinema, importing films from other European countries, mainly France and Germany and America. Hollywood and Hollywood cinema, as is the case even now, was extremely popular. So was French and German cinema. So 90%, that's a very big number, of all films that were being screened in Russia or that were popular there were coming from other European countries. So there is, what does that mean? There is no real idea of a national cinema, which is why Soviet cinema becomes so important in a country where you don't necessarily have a tradition of watching films that are made by your own industry, and your industry itself is extremely small. Then this idea of a national cinema, films made within your country for people in your country becomes extremely important. And the Russian film industry was small, as films made in Russia were not particularly popular. So even the films that were being made in Russia were not necessarily watched by too many Russians on a regular basis. Everyone preferred to watch films that were coming from other countries, right? So, which is why for the Soviet Union, cinema became extremely important as a strategic tool. Now, again, this is very crucial, cinema as a strategic tool. Again, in contrast to what was happening before the revolution, where there is very little in terms of filmmaking that is happening in the country, and the films that are made are not not very popular either. So when you start using cinema as a strategic tool, you realize and recognize the power that cinema has, that films have. So the film industry, like other industries in the Soviet Union, came under government control, and the Department of the People's Commissariat for Education was responsible for the administration of the film industry. This government agency was also in charge of the administration of issues related to education and culture. So now you have a particular department, the People's Commissariat for Education, which is in charge of promoting films and also ensuring that particular kinds of films are made, right? So just like power becomes centralized in the hand of the government, you have a department which is focusing on not only films and filmmaking, right, which is not only in charge of film culture, but now you also have a department which is looking at education. Now I want you to look at that connection between education and filmmaking. When both are looked after or sometimes even controlled by the same department, you are recognizing that cinema has the ability to teach. Cinema has the ability to educate, and cinema has the ability to disseminate particular kinds of ideas and ideology. And the Soviet Union recognized that very quickly, that cinema can reach out to everyone, including the illiterate. That is why cinema is important, because it's an audio-visual medium. You can communicate with everyone. You can communicate with the educated groups, and you can also communicate with people who don't have literacy. And in a organizational system where the working classes are important, you would have to use such an audio-visual medium like film, like cinema, which can be used to communicate with everyone, with the masses. And the new state of Soviet Union recognized that film was a medium that could entertain mass audiences, including the illiterate masses, but it could also be used effectively and powerfully for education and propaganda. So not only is it going to be educational in terms of say providing literacy, in terms of educating the people, but also propagating ideas, right? Propaganda, it's again an important term which comes up again and again when you read about Soviet cinema. The possibility of using cinema as a medium for propaganda, as a medium to promote particular kinds of ideas, particular kinds of political beliefs, right? And cinema continues to be used in that way around the world. Any kind of an audiovisual medium appeals to people, and therefore it can be used to promote particular kinds of ideas. Now, as a consequence of this recognition of cinema as a tool, the State Film School was established in 1919 to train and encourage filmmakers. So again, right after the 1917 revolution, you have the State Film School. It was one of the earliest state film schools in the world. So the government financed the film school, provided teachers and encouragement to filmmakers, and the chief practitioners of the Soviet School of Filmmaking came out of the State Film School, right? So you had Lev Kulshev, you had Alexander Dozenko, you had Vsevolod Pudovkin, Ziga Vertov, and you had Sergei Eisenstein. And I'm going to talk about them in the next lecture as well. So look at how the State Film School is working. all the important filmmakers of the Soviet Union are going to emerge from the state film school. So the government, one, is providing encouragement. It's not seeing films and cinema as only something that is needed for entertainment. It is recognizing that it is an art that can be learnt, right? Which is why you establish a school. You have schools for art, for example, or schools for music. So when you recognize that it is something, it's a skill that can be learned, which can then also be, that can also evolve into other ways of being. You establish a school and provide education to people, so they are not left to their own means. They have access to equipment, and that's very important for cinema. You need to have technology, right? You need to have cameras, and you need to have studios. You need to have spaces where you can work. You need to have editing tables, and some of these are very technical skills. And remember, it is an art form which is also collaborative. So you have actors, you have editors, you have directors, you have writers, you have a large group of people who come together to form film, to form cinema. So again, very important to understand how a film school might change the way in which filmmakers work, because they have been educated in a particular way. It's not something that they have learnt on their own. These are skills that they have acquired through formal education. And the long list of filmmakers that I talked about were all associated with this kind of and this style of filmmaking in cinema, right? And they all came out of the same space. So often they were collaborators, right? They were working with each other. They were helping each other out. Sometimes they disagreed, right? Sometimes their ideas did not come together, but it's important to understand that they were all coming from the same spaces. Then an important theoretical idea from that period that we need to know about is formalism, which was a movement, a theoretical movement in the 1920s, where there is an intellectual engagement with the notions of form and purpose of art in the newly formed state of the USSR. And it was a literary theory to be known as formalism, which is associated mostly with the works of the Soviet for the study of poetic language and the Moscow Linguistic Circle. And important writers and critics associated with it are Boris Eichenbaum, Viktor Shklovsky, and Yuri Tyanov, and Roma Jacobson. Now, formalism is a movement which focused on the notion of form and purpose of art, and particularly in the USSR. So not only do they have a film school, now they have a theory, right? A way of looking at art as something that serves a particular purpose, art that needs to have a particular form, right? That needs to work in a particular way. It began as a literary theory, but it obviously also affected the way in which filmmakers were then going to make films. They were going to think about form. They were going to think about the ways in which films can be made, the ways in which films are films should be made. So the theory of formalism emphasized that the form of the work of art was more important than its content, right? The formalists felt that a work of art was a deliberate construction, and the form of the work was designed by the artist so that the familiar became unfamiliar. The formalists called it the process of defamiliarization. Now, this is going to be extremely important, defamiliarization. So, when you see something on the screen or when you read a book, often in popular forms, whether it's popular cinema or popular writing, you expect to see something that you recognize, but defamiliarization means that you are going to not recognize, and you will find something that is unfamiliar. So that is the theory of formalism. Right, we are going to now take a break, and when we come back later on, we are going to discuss some of the filmmakers associated with Soviet cinema. Thank you. Hello everyone. I'm now going to talk about early Soviet cinema and some important filmmakers and theories that are associated with Soviet cinema. So I'll talk very briefly about formalism, some of the important ideas of formalism, which was not only important for literature but was also important for filmmakers, and formalism was based on the idea that the form of a piece of art, whether it's a book or a painting or a film, is extremely important, right? It is not only the story or the plot line which was emphasized earlier that is important, it is also how you write a story, right, or how you form a book or how you make film. And think of this in terms of particularly filmmaking, where the writer is one part of the filmmaking process, but there are many other people who are also participating in it. So you have the director bringing in their inputs, you have the actors bringing in particular kinds of interpretations and acting styles. So for filmmakers, formalism, particularly during the time period of the Soviet Union, becomes an extremely important and useful idea. It is something that is going to work for the filmmakers. How do you make a film? You know, it's not just a camera which is focused on a particular person, as is the case here. Filmmaking is an entire process where you have many other elements which are part of it. So one extremely important important experiment and effect that was discussed during the Soviet period was the Kuleshov effect. Now, it's very important to think of the Kuleshov effect in terms of how shots are put together, in terms of how you can take two different pictures and put them together. Please look at what is there on the screen. You have a plate of soup and a photograph, a shot of an actor then you have a dead woman, and again the same shot of the actor, and then you have a picture of a woman, and again the same shot. So the Kuleshov effect works on the basis of this idea that you can intercut the same neutral shot of an actor with the shots of a plate of soup, a dead woman, a child playing, a woman, and the audience is going to rave about the acting of the artist and see reactions on the same neutral shot of the face, where actually there were none. So this experiment that Lev Kuleshov performed showed that by simply editing ideas together, by using editing in a particular way, you can change how audience react to a shot. Now that discovery was extremely invigorating for the Soviet film industry, right? So the formalist theories of literature and linguistics were adapted for filmmaking, particularly through the idea of editing, and the Russian filmmaker discovered that simply juxtaposing one image against another could stimulate emotions and ideas in the audiences. So for the first time, you recognize that audiences are extremely important, how they react to a scene is extremely important, but it is possible through editing to control what the audience is going to see, how the audience is going to react to a particular scene, to a particular shot. So it is through editing that you can bring about these reactions in the audiences. And because for Soviet cinema it was extremely important to function educationally and to also function as sometimes propaganda, it becomes important to find ways to get a particular reaction from the audience, to and to not be completely dependent on the actor, right, or on how the actor is acting. So which is why Lev Kuleshov then had the same shot of the actor with the same facial expression juxtaposed again and again, simply with different images, and the recognition that every time people saw a different reaction on the face, even though the face had not changed, told the filmmakers about the psychology of viewers and how it can be affected by editing techniques, by simply cutting films in a particular way. So his principle was based on the idea that each shot is like a building block and becomes meaningful only in the context of the shots placed or juxtaposed around it. So shots became the building blocks of film. You build a film not from a story, not from a plot line, but through the use of particular shots, and you can change the context of the shots simply by changing what comes one after the other and what goes along with another shot. So the Kuleshov experiment not only was important for the Soviet filmmakers, but it's an idea that is used even now, that you put two pictures together, you put two different shots together, and you can bring about a particular kind of reaction in the viewers. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the birth of montage and how the Kuleshov experiment influenced the idea of montage in cinema. So Soviet cinema, particularly the films of Sergei Eisenstein, worked out the principles of montage to achieve stunning results on the screen. And Eisenstein is a very important filmmaker that you must familiarize yourself with. Then the origin of the word montage, it comes from the French word monter, meaning to assemble, to put things together, right? And it can, in the context of filmmaking, it can simply mean editing. Right. So, in popular cinema, the kind that we see even now, it sometimes refers to a concentrated sequence with shots or superimpositions, cuts, jump cuts, wipes, dissolves, etc. To create a kaleidoscopic effect to summarize a particular experience or transition in time, space, or situation. So, think of the films of Alfred Hitchcock, for example, and how he used his work is Hollywood, right? How he used montage in his films, where you use a variety of techniques, editing techniques, to bring things together on the screen for the audience. It's particularly useful in thrillers, for example, and the term can also refer to any sequence which creates a dramatic cinematic effect because of the manner in which the editing has been done. And so it's editing both of the image and of the sound. So it's a very useful technique associated early on in cinema with Eisenstein and with Soviet cinema, but now this coming together of different shots is a very commonly used technique. Right. Now, montage, particularly for Soviet cinema, became the leitmotif. It became one of the most important ways in which Soviet cinema and the Soviet movements were recognized, right? So, for the Soviet filmmakers, montage was not simply an editing technique, but a way to control the viewer's response to the images in front of them. So, like I said, it's not just cutting shots together, it's not just bringing them together like you would in a jigsaw puzzle, but it is doing it very consciously, right, with a particular plan in mind to bring about a particular reaction from the audience. So, the Soviet school went on to develop Kulshov's idea and to experiment with montage. They sought to shock the viewer by placing shots of people or objects in an unfamiliar way and forcing the viewer to reflect on the meaning of the image being shown. So, they are getting a particular kind of response from the viewer, and usually it is meant to shock the viewer. So, it is a defamiliarizing technique, right? It is defamiliarization. In literature, Brecht, for example, would call it the alienation effect. The audience immediately, when they see two very different images being put together, will react to it not through catharsis, not through a release of an expected emotion, but through shock. Right? They will be forced to think about what they are seeing on the screen. Why have these two things being put together? Why is it that things which are not connected to each other suddenly there on the screen? What does the filmmaker want us to think? Right? So, it makes the audience a more engaged audience, right? And it becomes filmmaking is not looking at the edit box. It's not just looking at a screen, it becomes a particular kind of process where the audience is expected to be a thinking audience, right? You are constantly wondering why things are working in a particular way. And like I said, the filmmaker most associated with it, with this particular movement is Sergei Eisenstein. The most influential figure for the theory of montage in Soviet cinema, the director of films like Battleship Potemkin and October, right? Eisenstein believed that a country that had just emerged out of a revolution should have a revolutionary culture, and the people must have a revolutionary consciousness. This was the main thrust of his filmmaking. He used montage as the cinematic equivalent of the dialectic method, which refers to the fusion or transcendence of opposites. So it became for him a method of penetrating reality, and it was an attack by Eisenstein on the traditional methods of constructing film, that is the linking of sequences in a smooth and undisturbed manner. So it's not going to be a simple connecting of dots that Sergei Eisenstein was doing through the use of shots in his films. He is trying to achieve something very, very different, very unique in cinema, and the purpose of doing this, making these unusual connections through the use of montage, is to bring about a revolutionary consciousness in the minds of the viewers. So now let's talk about his theory of montage. He wrote a lot of books about it. He discussed it, because in order to understand such a complex idea, you need to talk about it as well. You need to write about it to explain what it is that you are doing as a filmmaker. So his theories are based on the idea that montage emerges from the collision between different shots representing the thesis and antithesis. Emerging out of this collision is a synthesis, which is a completely new idea, right? So there is a collision, right? There is a crash that happens between the thesis and antithesis, right? So and out of that comes something which is completely new. So it's not just a mixing together of two things which are different from each other to come up with a mixture, but to come up with a completely new idea. That's the basis of his argument. And then in simple terms, it means the juxtaposition of conflicting shots to create a new sense or meaning that arises out of the conflict. So look at these shots at the bottom of the slide. These are from Battleship Potemkin, the famous Odessa step sequence. The images of violence are juxtaposed with images of innocence to create an unforgettable sequence of cinema that forces an emotional and intellectual engagement of the viewers and shocks him or her into political awareness. So you have images of a child that are combined with the images of a Cossack or a soldier. You have the images of a old woman with the anger that the revolutionaries feel around them. So by combining these two very different kinds of images, Eisenstein was projecting a completely different kind of idea, a completely different kind of meaning for the viewer. So the viewer becomes politically aware, right? They recognize that what they're watching on screen, this event that they're seeing is something that shouldn't have happened. There shouldn't be violence, and it is important for revolutionaries to participate, to become activists. So the viewer is not just watching for the sake of entertainment anymore. They are politically engaged, right? They are now affected by what they are seeing on the screen. It's not just simple entertainment, it is didactic, right? And it is also propaganda of a particular kind. So Eisenstein's theories about montage in particular were political theories, were political ideas, right, which are meant to affect the audience in a particular way. So remember that there is montage that is used even now, that is used across the world, and then there is Eisenstein's idea and theory of montage, which are not very similar to each other. It's not just an editing technique that we are talking about anymore. It now has a political purpose to it, right? So montage and technology for him were linked to each other, and as a consequence he uses the idea of comparing it to a car, where the use of this particular analogy shows us that science and technology and the idea of conflict are very important for his extremely important for his idea of montage, and also the effect that montage has on the spectator is implied by the movement of the car forward. So he describes it in such a way that you can very easily understand that montage in film is associated with the idea of science, technology, conflict, and moving forward in a particular way. The effect, and by moving forward he means the effect that it has on the spectator, right? Now these are some of the books that are associated with his theories. Now the next filmmaker that we are going to talk about is Dziga Vertov, and his idea of the Kino eye. Another important filmmaker of the Soviet school who came again from the state film school. He was a documentary filmmaker, so it's not only fictional films that we are talking about anymore as part of this movement, but also documentary films, non-fiction films. And for Vertov, the camera lens was Kino eye, or the film eye, an instrument through which one could achieve kino pravda, or film truth. So the camera becomes the point of focus for this particular filmmaker, right? And as you can see from this picture on the slide, this is from his film, this is a shot from his film. The focus is on the camera, and the camera is connected with the human eye. So the camera is another eye, only unlike the human eye, it captures images permanently, right? You can see them whenever you want to later on. It is going to capture images in a particular way, unlike the eye which sometimes sees but does not register. The camera also registers ideas. So for him, the idea of the camera was extremely important, as a documentary filmmaker, then the camera becomes a very important piece of equipment which records reality in a particular kind of way. So it's not just recording all reality in the way that the human mind does, where, like I said, we sometimes see things but don't interpret them, right? It just becomes part of our consciousness. The camera for him records things in a particular way. What it chooses to record, how it chooses to record, when, then becomes connected with political ideas, with certain political notions. Now he felt that the camera captured fragments of actuality which, when organized together, reveal a deeper truth that cannot be perceived by the naked eye, and he viewed fiction films with suspicion and instead called for recording life as it is. So he did not believe in the narratives and the plot lines that are part of fictional filmmaking. Instead, he thought that the camera should record life in reality, right? And the camera can reveal a truth that cannot be perceived by everyone else. Now, look at this shot. This is the first shot from his film called Man with a Movie Camera. The name itself tells you it's what the film is going to be about. There's a man who's going to record reality, but the first shot has the man with the movie camera seemingly standing on another camera, right? Seemingly standing on another equipment, another piece of equipment, the camera with its eye, right? Associated with the Kino eye, that was such an important notion for his filmmaking style. So clearly, the camera is the star. It's not the human being, but the camera, which is the point of focus for his films. So imagine the camera as an extremely important, not just an important tool, but as an important idea now. The camera is not just technology, something that you use to achieve a purpose, but the camera itself gets a life of its own, right? And so he glorified the camera. In particularly this film, Man with a Movie Camera, it became a very important part of his filmmaking style and his filmmaking process. This notion of the camera as central to filmmaking. So again, think of the camera as not just equipment, but the camera in terms of the political possibilities that it offers. Now, beyond the filmmaking, I would also quickly like to talk about Soviet cinema and acting. So preference was given to not theatre trained actors anymore, but to actors who would fit the style of the film. And the Soviet filmmakers recognized that acting in a film is different from acting in theatre. They emphasized the human body, gesture and movement, and downplayed the idea of individualism. So they often had non-actors, people who were not trained to be actors, but were common everyday people who were made part of the film. And this idea fit in very well with the early Soviet filmmakers, because they believed that the revolution was in the hands of the collective, the hands of the proletariat, the hands of the people. So acting styles, acting was no longer something that you really learnt in a film school, because then that would not necessarily fit in with every kind of film, with every kind of situation in cinema. So there was a particular preference for non-actors, and because they were downplaying individualism, they did not want to focus on stars, they did not want celebrity actors. Instead, what they wanted and what they wanted to focus on was the masses. The collective became extremely important. Now, finally, I would like to quickly talk about the demise of Soviet cinema and how the Stalinist regime became the end of experimentation for Soviet cinema. So, in the 1930s, Joseph Stalin launched the Great Purge, a major campaign of political repression. Millions of people who were suspected of being a threat to Soviet politics were executed, exiled, or sent to labor camps. The formalists were targeted in particular, and formalism was associated with being an idea that only appeals to the elite and not to the masses. And the formalists who did survive, like Eisenstein, were forced to cooperate with the Stalinist regime and its cultural policies. So this was the end of experimentation with people and filmmakers being forced to give up the ideas that were important for them. But Soviet cinema, although in its original form does not exist anymore, but it continues to affect current filmmakers. Even in Indian cinema. So whenever you see a scene where there is somebody's entire life is shown in a few minutes by showing us shots together that are brought together, it's montage, right? So think of Soviet cinema as something which continues to affect our viewing and cinema even now. So thank you very much for being a patient audience today and listening to what I had to say about Soviet cinema. So thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very precious session. Dear friends, if you want to give your feedback regarding this particular lecture, then you can mail us at info.cec@nic.in, and very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube for you so that you can see the lecture the number of times you wanted. We would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.